My guest today is Larry Lessig, professor of law and leadership at Harvard Law School. Larry is the author of numerous influential books and articles, including Codes 2.0, which we discuss at length in this episode. If you have been listening to Scaling Theory since the very beginning, you probably remember that I cited a couple of books that changed my perception of everything in the first episode. Code is one of these books. Larry Lessig develops what he calls the pathetic dot theory, in which he explains that all things are influenced by four constraints: the law, economic forces, norms, and architecture. In this conversation, Larry and I talk about the importance of these four constraints in the digital economy and assess which ones have scaled the most in recent years. We also explore how complexity science can contribute to Larry's theory by seeing the dots and their constraints as a complex network. We then steer our conversation toward open source in AI, assess how regulation at the hardware layer could solve software issues, and consider whether we can trust our institutions and current regulations to do so, or if we need to scale other institutions for that purpose. I hope you enjoy our discussion. All right. Larry, thank you so very much for joining me on the podcast. I've been following you for many years. And as I mentioned actually on the very first episode of this podcast, your book is amongst the very few that really much changed my perception of everything. In fact, I think it's one of those books that stays with you forever. And I'm here talking about Code. Once you've read the book, you cannot unread the book, and it really shaped my way of seeing the world. Already, I can thank you so very much for that, and I look forward to the conversation. What I've done is that I have divided my questions into two different parts. First, I want to talk about the pathetic digital dot, or the pathetic dot theory, and then I want to move towards the open source versus IP and see what it means for AI, because we can't escape but to talk about AI eventually in 2025. So if I go back now to the first part of the conversation, starting with a very short question, you explain in Codes that there is a pendulum movement between what you call East Coast codes, those are the legal rules and standards, and the West Coast code, that is computer code. Where do we stand in 2025? Are we moving toward the East or the West?
That's a great question. Obviously, the dominant regulator of people's behavior online is still West Coast code. If you think about the business model of social media, which is an engagement business model, and the techniques that are deployed to trick the human body, brain into engaging are the most significant interventions in human life that we have right now, as you imagine all of these devices trying to grab your attention and keep your attention focused. The deployers of that code are basically West Coast people. And so I think West Coast still wins. And to the extent East Coast regulators think about the idea of regulating in this space, they just talk themselves into doing nothing. Even child online safety protections have been stalled in Congress because of just the basically broken infrastructure of regulation that is the regulation of Congress. Now, what's interesting is if you keep on going west, I don't know if you say you get east or you just go further west, you think about China. China, in the context of social media, has been quite an effective regulator. Even though there's a big fight about whether the Chinese company TikTok is available in the United States or not, it's not available in China. The version of TikTok that's available in China is a radically neutered and more healthy platform for engaging kids. And the context of social media engagement in China is much more extensively regulated. So certain hours where kids are not allowed to be playing games online and the like. So there, what we would call East Coast code has been much more effective in regulating West Coast code or technology, but we don't yet have that merging here in the United States.
Yeah, and indeed, I never considered indeed if you keep going west, do you reach east, and what does it mean? And in fact, we've seen that the people anticipating a ban of TikTok moved to Red Knots. It's another of those social media provided by the very same company. And when it comes to restriction and all that, it seems to be way more effective at censoring free speech. But so let me ask a follow up question on that. In a talk that you gave at the Codex Future Law Conference in 2022, I quote you here, you stress that we need to obsess about the fact that business models eat law, end of quotes. So to go now to the four constraints on the pathetic dot that you explore in the book, it seems that economics is taking precedence over law. And obviously, as lawyers, we immediately recognize how problematic this can be. And in fact, I would say we even see that large tech companies, they understand that very well, and therefore design their business models in a way to prevent them from controlling all behaviors, because if they do not control those behaviors, then you cannot assign liability. And the Digital Services Act recognizes this logic very much. Now, the question I ask for you is whether the fact that business models eat law is always problematic, or whether it can also be beneficial. And what I have in mind is the fact that law enforcers do struggle to apply rules and standards against open source and decentralized networks, and yet they can create positive externalities. So what do you make of that?
When I was commenting about business models eating law, I think I was really thinking about the American context in particular. I was trying to find a way to talk about the thing I've been obsessed about for the last 18 years, which is the deep corruption of the American political process. When Frances Haugen came out as the Facebook whistleblower and went to Capitol Hill and testified on Capitol Hill about what Facebook was doing or not doing to protect both its users and the society that was affected by its users. There was a brief moment when Congress on the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, were riled up and like eager to do something to address the harmful effects of these social media platforms. But very quickly, lobbyists from Silicon Valley operating in Washington succeeded in dividing Congress by leveraging the enormous opportunity of campaign funding to make it so that Congress was not willing to step up and do anything in response to what they had acknowledged was a serious problem. So the point is like the much more effective, instrumentally rational actor on the field is business relative to government, corporations relative to the state. And what that means is the state's regulatory objective is increasingly defeated, especially in the United States. Now, contrast that with Europe, where it's astonishing to see the number of very significant EU-wide regulations that have been deployed, from privacy all the way through the AI Safety Act. I'm not sure I agree with the strategy of those regulations, but it does evince the truth that there's a capacity to regulate, which is greater than the capacity to regulate in the United States. So I wouldn't assert the slander I made against the United States government as forcefully if I were in Europe, but I think it's a concern in both contexts.
Why are you saying that you are not quite sure whether or not you agree with the strategy behind those?
Obviously, there's a ton of stuff in the DSA and DMA, but the objective of the regulatory strategy in gross was to flesh out instances of misinformation or disinformation and facilitate a process by which those things could be corrected, as if that's the problem. Because from my perspective, that's not the problem. The problem is a business model that is trying to maximize engagement. Even if you turned off all misinformation or disinformation, it would still be a problem, because it would then deploy within a restricted set. The AI would deploy within a restricted set the stuff it needs to deploy in order to drive engagement. And engagement produces its own externalities. Those externalities are the problem that I think government needs to be targeting. So the regulation Europe deployed in one narrow category for ads targeted at children, there's a basic turning off of that business model. But I think the more important strategy would have been to turn off the business model generally. The bigger even more extreme example of this kind of good intentions gone bad, I think, is with data privacy. We now have almost a generation of people who've been raised being assaulted with these cookie notices and warnings about kind of data that is being collected and stuff that could be done with that data, and forced to go through a ritual of asserting that they've read privacy policies and they understand them and they're agreeing to them, when all of that is just a complete fabrication. Nobody's reading any of this stuff. Nobody has any idea what the privacies actually are. But the conceit of consent has allowed the regime to march on. Like, we're giving you consent, and so that's all we could give you. And I just think that was a strategically bad decision for anybody who's concerned about privacy, because we get to the place we are right now where nobody does anything, they pay any attention. What are you supposed to do? Have a little spreadsheet next to your computer and check off the kind of privacy policies and decide where you're going to go on the basis of privacy policies? It's crazy talk. Instead, what I think they should have done was to mark off a set of practices that are presumptively okay and a bunch of practices that are presumptively not okay. And a narrow slice between those two presumptive buckets would be like places where you need to facilitate some choice, some decision by the user about data with respect to that. But rather than simplifying and actually being a little bit more normative about the kind of practices, they will fall back on the idea as long as people consent to it, there can't be anything wrong with it, which I just think is hopelessly naive and has encouraged the kind of industry that we've got right now.
People and industries have reacted, of course, to GDPR. We see that Europeans spend an average of 575 million hours a year to click on the cookie banners, whilst the businesses also have adopted new strategies around it. So are we better off in the end? Indeed, that's something we may want to debate. But so far, we've been talking about the relationship between law and economic forces. Now, let me make a statement and have you react to it. It seems to me that amongst the four constraints, so again, law, economic forces, norms, and architecture, it seems to me that architecture is the one that benefits the most from digitalization. And the reason why I'm saying that is that the digital architecture code is inherently scalable. It benefits from increasing returns, unlike traditional building architecture, which relies on wood and concrete, which typically exhibits decreasing returns. So digitalization of architecture changes its ability to scale. And I do not see that shift happening with norms, law, and economics, because they were global to some extent and they remain global, whereas architecture was very much a local phenomenon and now is a global one. So what do you make of this hypothesis?
I think it's a great point, and I wouldn't disagree with it. I'm not sure that you could say as strongly that both norms and law have not been globalized in an important. Norms have been globalized in the sense that practices which could only have been governed locally, and I mean governed in the way norms are governed, like those practices about how people engage with each other, have now become global because the infrastructure driving those practices has become global. 10 years ago, there were certain places in the world where you could have gone and seen people sitting together at dinner on their cell phones. You would have, I'm not going to make any kind of cultural slights here, but I think we could have agreed on which cultures those would have been. Now it's every culture, no matter where you are. You go into a restaurant and people sitting together on their phones, or kids sitting together, 5 of them sitting around a couch, all of them sitting there on their phones. And so that norm of being present with the person that you are with, which I think 10 or 20 years ago was pretty solid, has now changed dramatically because the infrastructure that drives those norms has become universal as well. Same thing with law. I don't know how to calibrate this, but I would have thought the diversity of rules regulating engagements and commercial engagement would have been greater than it is in this kind of globalized context. Even if formally not similar, when you substitute in private optional law or like arbitration structures, effectively they become universal. So I do think it's a nice perspective to think about the extent to which these things remain subject to local control. But I think once you take that perspective, it's hard to see code as like of a different kind than these other modalities.
Yeah. Let me now ask about the relationship between those constraints and what it does to the dot and how the dot reacts. And here, what I have in mind is complexity science, because it seems to me that it has a lot to contribute to your pathetic dot theory. And let me give you 4 reasons why. I guess I'll start with 2, let you react, and then introduce two more. The first one, it seems to me that complexity science provides tools to measure whether the dot is robust or fragile. A dot that is robust could or can withstand constraints even when they are combined, whereas a dot that is fragile will actually change fundamentally as soon as you touch one of those 4 constraints. The second reason why I think complexity has a lot to bring to it is that it helps analyze the dynamics between agents. That is how dots can actually form a network to become more robust.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. It's an important complement. I think it's also, I don't know if Damien Santola's work, I think the book is just called Change, but he's thinking about different types of norms and what kind of information architecture helps change or transform those different types of norms. And for some types of norms, is there a fire in the building? A kind of broadcast information structure is perfectly fine to achieve the objective, which is to get people out of the building. But other norms, are we tolerant or inclusive of people based on their sexual orientation, don't change simply because you provide information about sexual orientation. It requires much more understanding of like how other people are viewing the same issue. And so the complexity of transformation of those types of norms is much greater. And so what that's doing, similar to the point you were making, is it's complexifying the structure of norms so that you can begin to see strategically which types of interventions will work with what kinds of norms. And that parallels, I think, the concern or the observation that the complexity theory might bring, which is to think more about the agent on who the norm is acting and the resilience of that agent to that intervention. This is like a wonderful extension of the kind of first level insight, crude point that I was trying to make 25 years ago, but which I hope we can see lots more work that tries to develop that and develop the insight of what the right kind of regulatory infrastructure for whatever particular purpose we're trying to regulate is.
Yeah, okay. So here I have to say, I think you are being too modest because I'm reading your book once every 2 years, and you do mention that the dot react, this has an effect on the constraint. So it's not as if you were just providing very simplistic framework, but okay.
Oh, you've read the book more than I have.
Let me introduce 2 more reasons why complexity, I think, may have some helpfulness in better understanding your theory. The third reason would be that complexity science studies how micro patterns between agents influence their environments. So when applied to your framework, this helps capture how the dot reaction affects these constraints, which is a lot of what we see, especially when it comes to how people react to regulation and what it does to the policymakers and so on and so forth. And the fourth and final reason why I think complexity has something to bring to the table is that it helps to understand feedback loops. So whether a change in the ecosystem is temporary and will return to the original state, in which case the feedback loop are negative, or it could be that due to positive feedback loop, the ecosystem, as soon as you change one of the constraints, will actually never revert to its original state. Again, I'll let you react to those.
Yeah, I think that's really important type of insight to extend my own reasoning with. Again, it feels though that what this is demonstrating is how you would have to complexify the theory to make it more usable in regulatory strategy. I think it's descriptively helpful. There's a great book by Jacob Ward called The Loop, I think, which is talking about a particular dynamic in the context of social norms and architecture in the internet and business models in the internet space, which has this feedback scenario and drives people to really destructive positions, whether that's because of addiction or misunderstanding or whatever. And I think that finding a framework for modeling that more formally would be very valuable. So it sounds like what you're describing might be such a framework.
So now, as you can guess from my question, a lot of what I do when I'm not reading legal rules and standard and legal papers is that I look at complexity science. Now, I see many books behind you. Unfortunately, I must say that I'm not able to identify too many of them. Whether you're not looking at the legal field and investing that field, where are you drawing inspiration from? Is that behavioral psychology? Are you looking at from almost a epistemological perspective? What is of interest to you that you eventually try to bring to your legal work?
That's a hard question because I'm an old man. So there have been many different stages of things that I'm obsessed with. And right now, I guess my obsession is historical, mainly because I think it becomes such a useful source to think about these theoretical perspectives from. So I guess that's if I'm free to roam, that's where I will be reading. But I'm not very free to roam because I've got too many things I'm trying to do, unfortunately. It's a really bad character not to be able to focus on just a few things, but that is the flaw of my character.
And what about 25 years ago when you were writing code and Code 2.0? At the time, you lived in California, or at least that's where you taught. So do you remember the kind of mindset you had and the kind of things you were reading?
Yeah, I think we talk about this a lot around here now that I'm back at Harvard. So I originally wrote code. I was here at Harvard, and then I finished it. I was in Berlin. And then when I came back, I went to Stanford. But what was striking about the early internet days here at Harvard was there were a number of really incredibly interesting figures. Charlie Nesson, who started the whole thing, but John Zittrain and Terry Fisher and Yochai Benkler. There was an almost like we're discovering a new space and like mapping out the way to think about that new space. And that feels very different today. I feel like there was a whole bunch of hopefulness that people like Yochai were quite focused on, how this was going to radically change ways of production and egalitarian objectives would be realized. And my views were more cynical, maybe pessimistic about how forces would intervene to change the hopefulness of this platform. And unfortunately, I think I was right about that intervention. But I think there was a naive hopefulness that it would be great to be able to rediscover today.
Yeah. I want to come back on that toward the very end of the conversation, whether you are more optimist today than you were at the time. I'm also reminded of this book. I don't know if you have a look at it, entitled Crypto Anarchy, Cyber States, and Pirate Utopias. That was published by the MIT Press in 2001. It's very instructive to read in 2025 because you see the mindset at the time and the predictions that were wrong and the ones that were correct. So it's a good way to capture what may have been the atmosphere at Harvard and not too far away at the MIT. Moving on to part 2 of our conversation, and here focusing more on open source, work on intellectual property explores how creative ideas scale across the web. Now, we know that when systems are open source, it comes with many pitfalls and risks, but we also know that ideas scale more rapidly because very often it fosters innovation. Now, if we apply that to today's and the AI landscape, how do you foresee the role of open source AI models? Do you think they will disappear in a couple of years, like we've seen with social media, although maybe it's coming back, but clearly the main social media today are closed source? Or on the contrary, do you think they may or will dominate the space as we've seen with email protocols, code repositories, and other foundational internet infrastructure?
The essential feature that open source provides is a feature that's provided really at every layer of the internet. And that is just permissionless innovation. The end-to-end principle in the original architecture of the internet was a principle that basically guaranteed that you could innovate without seeking permission from somebody else to innovate. If the telephone networks had controlled the original internet in the way that they wanted to control the internet, then nobody would have been allowed to develop voice over IP because the network owner would not have permitted it, because that would conflict with the business model of the network owner. But end-to-end basically said, there is no business model here that gets to control. You get to do with it what you want. Open source is creating basically the same reality. Open source is the freedom to take a resource and develop it how you want without getting permission from somebody else to be able to do that, which means strategic forbidances can't interfere with the potential for innovation. I think that the same dynamic is going to happen in the context of AI, no doubt. Already it has. Hugging Face is an extraordinary platform that is encouraging such a valuable range of people to be innovating. It is the only way that 90% of the world has access to the opportunities of AI and the opportunities to learn how to develop and deploy AI because of open source platforms like Hugging Face. I do think, though, that there's going to be a moment when what I think many of us treated as an unalloyed good becomes more complicated, because the very term open source is deeply ambiguous in the context of AI. What do you mean open source? Are you talking about the weights? Are the weights freely available? You're talking about the software that was used to train or the data that was used to train. There's many layers here that each could be proprietary or open source. And we don't really have a clear sense when we're talking about open source, which of these things is important to keep open. And it's going to be especially difficult as these models become more powerful to recognize the risks that they present and the context and the question that will create is whether we want these risks in the world in an unrestricted way. Now, I think people's initial reaction to this question was to say we need to be concerned about open source and like maybe limit open source AI models. I actually am increasingly intrigued by the idea of developing a more robust hardware infrastructure within which the software functions, so that to the extent there are concerns about what the software is doing, you could address them at the hardware layer. Think of this as the kind of circuit breaker theory of how we allow AI development to occur. So it's like circuit breakers became a mandatory part of electrical grids. And what they did was prevent problems in one part of the grid from spreading across other parts of the grid. And they also had the consequence of enabling wide range of electrical innovation. Like, you don't need to get permission from the electricity company to develop a product that you will plug into the wall in your house. As long as you live up to the specified protocols, you can plug anything into the house. And if it's wrong or it's dangerous, it flips the circuit breaker and all damage is localized. In the context of AI, could imagine developing infrastructure that would have hardware that would have the equivalent of these circuit breakers built in, so that if a model runs away or a model becomes destructive, you would have a way to shut it down or to slow it down. And if it's done the right way, the model can't resist that in the way that we fear these super intelligent models will resist any effort to regulate them. And if you had that infrastructure, this is the punchline for open source, the argument against open source would be weakened, because you would say, look, it doesn't matter if lots of people are developing here. To the extent a problem is developed, we'll have a way to address it. And so I think that would be really useful to think about how we move the collective understanding along to begin to build an infrastructure of regulation at the chip layer or the hardware layer, and what that would look like. My intuition is that the essential element of that is that the extent of control is minimal. There are many people who have this kind of very extensive, robust conception of how they want the chips to control what gets run on the chips. And so it's licensing structures, and it's can't be Chinese and all sorts of things like that. And if you start with that, it'll be shot down right away, because there'll be a million different reasons why people don't want to agree to that level of regulation in the chip, especially if it's essentially the NSA that's getting to decide whose chips get shut down. But if you imagine an international body that had a simple mandate, which was in response to a demand, they evaluate a risk, and if they see a risk, they slow down or shut down operation. I think it's more likely you could get agreement about that infrastructure, create a development context that would be safer, and thereby encourage both proprietary or non-open source and open source.
Decentralization loves mistakes, because indeed then the mistake or the error or the problem is more local than if you have just one single entity in charge of it, because if then it goes wrong, then it may indeed impact the entire ecosystem. You've mentioned Hugging Face. We had actually Thomas Wolf, one of the co-founder, on the podcast, and I asked the very same question. Where do you see open source going? The answer was that it will take over the entirety of the ecosystem. But have discussion also on the podcast with Yann Lequin from Meta and others, it seems clear to me that the quality of your AI model is what you need to be able to compete in the first place, but it's not just the end of it. And it's not because you have the best quality because of open source and many contributions that necessarily you will outcompete your competitors. The ability to push the model to billions of users is also of importance. Reputation is of importance. User habits. I ask my students quite regularly, which of the system do you use? Most of them will answer ChatGPT in 2025. And even if I provide them with a benchmark showing them that some open source equivalents are better in terms of quality, I'm not sure that's a convincing argument for them to switch from one to the other. So indeed, that's a complex matter, but we try to simplify it. And the question I have for you is whether our simplification of what is open source is not problematic to the extent that it totally neglects the complexity of what we've been discussing. And one example I have in mind is the AI Act that provides exemptions for open source models, but that's a binary concept. You are open source according to the AI Act, or you are not. There is no in between, when in practice we know there is a spectrum. So what do you make of that simplification? Can we escape it as lawyers, or are we doomed to play?
Yeah, I don't think it's coherent to just say open source in the context of AI. You need to be more specific about what you're talking about. But I want to relate this back to the point you were making about your students in ChatGPT. Remember that the most important free software in the context of the internet was not really experienced by the consumer, even though it was deeply important to the internet. The GNU Linux operating system, the Apache servers, all of these infrastructural elements were free and open source software. And it was the developers or the people who were taking and building stuff that used that to be able to do their building. And even if on top of all of that, people are using proprietary software or like Word instead of the LibreOffice suite, that doesn't diminish the significance of the open source contribution. It just shows that the contribution is to a different class here. And I think that's the same thing with AI. Right now, AI is presenting itself most prominently in the context of GPTs, Claude and ChatGPT and the like. But of course, there's AI in lots of other contexts that we don't even think of as AI. So your newsfeed, I really loved Sam Altman's tweet on, I think it was December 27th, when he said algorithmic news feeds are the first at-scale misaligned AI, which is really brilliant and true. But we don't think about that as AI because we don't experience it in a way that's like demonstrating seriousness of its AI. And I think that the development of AI in the future will be increasingly like locating AI kind of under the hood, making it like something that's adding functionality, but you don't necessarily see the motor. You think about pictures of the early industrialization of factories where you would have these huge motors sitting in the middle of these factory spaces. And of course, the whole progress of industrialization is finding ways to hide those or put them more into the infrastructure of the machines rather than at the center of the space. I think that's what AI will do as well. And open source AI will have a complete advantage in that space. It already does. If you think about where is Meta's open source AI contribution, it's in the million other entities that are taking their Llama platform and adapting it or fine tuning it or using it in ways even Meta doesn't want. I think it's important to keep this concept at the center, even if we need to become a little bit more sophisticated about what it is that's salient about it being open.
Yeah. So the infrastructure layers are key. And if we push for them the open source, then, as you just explained, it will impact all of the other layers that build on top. So that would be a good use of legal rules and standards. Now, let me ask about a more problematic one when it comes to open source, because it seems to me that maybe indirectly, a lot of our current rules and standards, and that applies in the US and in the EU and probably elsewhere, do favor closed source systems because it is much easier to comply with them than if you are open source. So a couple of examples would be data protection laws that impose strict data handling requirements. And of course, it's more difficult to comply if you are a decentralized project running an open source platform. Corporate governance. They also push for centralized control of the foundation models and AI because it's easier to manage liability. And antitrust, we have to talk about it. It prohibits cooperation between economic actors. So it makes it much harder to contribute to open source project than if you are within a company that is deemed one legal entity, in which case there is no cartel possible. So do you share that sentiments that the law is indirectly favoring closed source? And if so, what do we make out of it as lawyers? Do we first focus on upcoming rules and standards such as the AI Act, the DSA, and all the things we've discussed, and make sure that at least those are neutral? Or do we go back to the laws that have been here for hundreds of years and try to reassess them in light of open source?
I think it's a mistake to allow the law unnecessarily to burden open source development. And it's not just a mistake, sometimes it's intentional, because open source development is often a competitive threat to dominant industries or actors within an industry. So I can see how it naturally would seem regulations are better able to be effectuated if you had a proprietary or closed source infrastructure. But I think that's a limitation in the thinking of the lawyers or the regulators, not a limitation in the nature of nature. And so I think that there should be a constant effort among regulators and lawyers to work out the regulatory equivalence that would give the regulator what the regulator wants, but in a context that permits or encourages open source development. And so that might force innovation in legal regulation, but that would be a great thing. We lawyers need to repeat more frequently just how broken the law is. It's not because I'm not a libertarian, I'm not an anarchist in the sense that I don't think there ought to be regulation. I think there ought to be regulation. But I can both think there ought to be regulation and recognize how broken the system of regulation that we've evolved is, and how, especially in the United States, where we've constitutionalized some of these traditions, meaning you can't change them unless you amend the Constitution, which of course you can't do, gives produce a legal system which is just terrible at delivering the most basic things that it ought to be delivering. And I celebrate the future where AI will eliminate 70% of lawyers. I think that's an underestimate. And I think that'll be a great thing for the rule of law. I think it will radically lower the cost of rule of law. It'll spread the rule of law in all sorts of contexts that it doesn't exist right now because it's just too expensive. And that we ought to be encouraging that future. Like we ought to be finding ways to push it ahead and recognize that open source will contribute to that. So we ought to be bending over backwards to make sure that the infrastructure of regulation we are deploying does not unintentionally or unnecessarily burden the capacity for open source.
Okay, let me ask a final question reacting to what you just said. You expressed a deep skepticism about our ability and our institutions' ability to actually address pressing challenges. And as you just said, that's a very nuanced point of view, which is hard to hear sometimes nowadays. But it's not because you believe in the rule of law that necessarily you have to accept all of regulations as being the most wonderful ever created. Now, since the book, you've published all the books and papers on political corruption, and you showed the limits that we can put in public officials. And to some degree, it's not just the individual level, it's also all of the institutions. That seems to be a common theme in your research. Now, as I mentioned on the podcast, it seems to me that one key issue is to align the personal incentives of our policymakers with the common good. Now, this is hard because, as the economist James Buchanan once said, this requires a constitutional layer within those agencies to align the incentives. It is not there. And so then you need to go to Congress for them to vote to introduce that constitutional layers within the agencies. And you go back to the very same problem. Do congresswomen and congressmen have an incentive to vote for such constitutional layers within governmental agencies? Not so much. So here's my question. Are we doomed to remain stuck with misaligned incentives, or is there a way out? And again, please be aware that this is my very last question, so we'll see whether we conclude on a positive or a negative note, this conversation.
I think you look at the most recent election in the United States, and there's both reason for hope and reason for fear. So the more obvious is reason for fear, because obviously at the presidential level, the corrupting influence of money was quite pronounced and in plain sight. So Donald Trump was a strong critic of crypto until the crypto industry pulled together $100 million or so. And then all of a sudden he loves crypto. And as long as all Bitcoin is developed in the United States, he's for it. The level of kind of stupidity is astonishing, but there it is. Bring money to the table, his policy position flips. And I think that we're going to see in the manifestation of the policies he plays out the way this works. For example, he was aligned with the MAGA movement, defined the MAGA movement's anti-immigrant position. So then the question was, what about people getting the H-1B visa, which is a special visa given to people with certain capabilities? And there it is, Elon Musk, his largest contributor, comes out and says he wants more H-1B visas. And the MAGA movement says, wait a minute, our whole point was we should be hiring Americans first. Now you're saying that we're going to bring in foreign tech workers instead of hiring Americans. And indeed, Elon lays off engineers at his Tesla factories and then brings in H-1B visa engineers to replace them. They're cheaper. He has more power over them because they can't quit. Otherwise, they have to go home. So it's a kind of indentured servitude in the favor of his economic interest against the philosophical interest that apparently motivated that movement. So I think that the depressing story is there's a lot here to see, to think that this corrupting influence, the Buchanan alignment of interests is at the constitutional layer just doesn't exist. On the other hand, the Trump victory represents the deep frustration most people have with government, the deep sense that government just failed. And the Democrats, for so long, have just tried to ignore that. That's just crazy talk. And we're just going to believe in the institutions. We're going to continue to speak as if all the institutions are fine. That strategy obviously failed. And because it so clearly failed, I think there's going to be a moment of reckoning and rethinking on the Democratic side to try to match the Republican side. And on the Democratic side, I think it's more likely they're going to start talking about the corrupting influence of money and pushing ideas, the objective of which is to remove that corrupting influence. And to the extent they do that, then Buchanan's alignment of the interest is more easily achieved. I think the challenge with the way Buchanan presented it is it made it into a harder problem than I think it practically is. I don't know how to align incentives. I do know how to disable misaligned incentives. If you are talking about how to fund the elections of representatives to your Congress, the last thing in the world you want is a system where they're spending all of their time bending over backwards, sucking up to the most powerful economic interests in the country in order to fund their campaigns. Why? Because they will never be able to resist those economic interests. This is Machiavelli squared, right? Because the economic interests will demand that they serve fealty to them, and in that demand, to guarantee that the regulator can't act in the way that's in the public interest as opposed to benefiting that private interest. So the alignment of interest, that's really complicated, but eliminating this misaligned interest, that's relatively simple. And we could start moving through things that are plainly misaligned interest. And at some point, maybe it's enough so that the representative could begin to say, look, I'm going to try to figure out what's in the public good. Like, that might be wrong, but that's what I care about. What do I think will actually advance the interest of the people who elect me? And if they could be free to lead, as my friend Buddy Romer used to say, if they were free to lead, you get more leadership. Right now, they're not free to lead. Now they've got to spend all their time sucking up to economic wealth so that they can fund campaigns. And I don't know what they get beyond just funding their campaigns. They certainly don't get governance that they can believe is actually advancing the public interest.
Now, what would be quite interesting would be to measure the extent to which our officials in the EU are indeed freer, because the extent, I mean, sure, you can finance political campaigns, but it's very limited here in the EU compared to the US.
We started here. This is the point about the EU has actually succeeded in passing substantial regulation, whether right or wrong in its substance, in contexts where America hasn't. GDPR, DMA, DSA, the AI safety, all of these are like unthinkable in America at the federal level. And unthinkable, not because we're not smart. I think it's unthinkable because the economic interests that would block them are just so overwhelming.
Yeah, I think it's a good place for us to end the conversation. Thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. I hope to see you in person very soon. But in the meantime, take care of yourself. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.